Okay, so with this drone footage, what I was trying to show as we take off, you can see on the right hand side here beside the road how the whole of the gully is full of lantana and other weeds there. A little bit more to the right you can see individual clumps, and you can also see how the moisture content makes the areas around those clumps greener as well as the clumps themselves greener. A lot of places where you look at that material across the creek bank there all along and how it spreads out much wider, pretty soon all of those smaller clumps will become one massive thicket, as the back section shows there. And then as you come around you can see how many trees are being killed off here and how thick the wild tobacco plant is there, in with all of that material of the lantana. That's all of the clumps that you can see, and then the dead trees being killed off by all of that material. When we swing around to the road, you can see along the edges of the road how much this material uses the water and the runoff from the road as a extra resource to make it much more higher yield. Because these plants, when they get access to water like that, this is a whole creek. The creek's actually below the vegetation here. It's being pumped all those nutrients, so it stays active, seeding and reproducing all year round. See, the gum tree there is completely swallowing up and being climbed by the plants. So nothing. Part of this that I wanted to show is that when you look down into this material, and you can only see this from an aerial point of view, nothing gets through that thicket. There are no animal thoroughfares through that stuff there. It's just a complete mess, a complete thicket that holds out everything. And it's very interesting to see how this material works in unison with the wild tobacco. And the government does nothing about this. The fence line's completely swallowed within that material. When a lot of this seeding of these plants, it's all the water's a vehicle for this plant to be able to propagate and move forward down through these watercourses. You often see this with these fences, and the information that they put out isn't even correct. When you watch how the wire drips, the condensation, that starts the seeding off and the plant grows up underneath the wire. You'll see that further down in the other paddock to our right when we do go around there later. But I wanted to show just how thick this material and the vines that grow with it then are growing up this cliff face. When the drone comes up higher, you can actually see right across these hillsides how much those clumping sections of those bushes with individual bushes starts to fill in the gaps and then starts to become one big thicket. But you can see the seeds of the way this moves across the terrain, and that's one of the biggest problems with the Department of Primary Industries and Daff and the other biological controls that they're trying to peddle and push, which have never been successful with the lot of stuff. The minuscule amount that they say that has been successful on one plant, not another, skips across there and it's only 10% successful anyway. All of these things are their own story, but 10%, it's an absolute waste of time, the millions of dollars we put into this process for a magical quick fix that never works. There are no magical quick fixes in anything to do with nature. So this material, as you can see, nothing gets to this gum tree, and that's just all the way along these areas. So that's what I was trying to show, and you can see how much the vine material up further grows up through those trees. Nothing gets to that gum tree. It's just so sad that we get so many people who come through and say, "Oh no, I'm a bush regenerator," whether they are or they aren't. And therefore, some animal may use this material. When you actually look at what the government actually says, they never list what the animals are, and it's only some may use it. But when you look at this footage is crystal clear. The fact that if you work out the hectares and you say there's 10 million hectares plus that are currently, covered in this material, and you look at that, there is absolutely no workforce clearing this material out. Look at this stuff here, how fantastic it is over this creek, running along the edge of this embankment, completely swallowed up. And this is 20, 30 kilometres of this type of infestations along these roads in varying amounts, but continuously, Lantana and that. Look at those trees completely covered. There is nothing showing of those trees back there. Nothing up this embankment. Nothing's been up this embankment or through these areas in a very, very long time. It's just criminal what actually is happening. So you got 10 million hectares. If you said there was 10 animals per hectare, that's what, 100 million animals? I think it is from memory. Yeah, and nobody bothers about those animals when they want to say to you, oh well, some animal may benefit from this material. Have a look at that. What animal benefits from that garbage? It's just disgraceful, the lies that we get told while our country gets swallowed by this material. We're heading for, they say, 35 million hectares to be covered, and they'll get there under their current regime and the way they do their work, do this stuff. They'll get us to the 35 million or more. It's going to be a lot more, because where this material is allowed to grow like this, running off hard roads, hard surfaces, it's just getting fed enormous amounts of water under any liquids situation. That's why this sort of material, you'll drive through Australia, you look out off the side of the road and everything will be dry as, but that verge right on where it comes off the road will be green. And that's why. And that's what the Lantana is seeking to exploit. Like for something that doesn't think, the ability to exploit the actual dynamics of an environment is incredible and very, very successful. And these scientists and the DPI and the rest of the crew that tell you, oh, don't worry about this, don't worry about that, oh, we're doing something here and we're not doing anything there, it's a disgrace. You look at the councils have admitted, all of the councils locally here and down south are admitting that they Lantana's now, as far as they're concerned, a low risk item. Have a look at this. How can you call this low risk? And this is right. This is pouring out of the national park from Mount Glorious. This is from that waterway down, and yet they still haven't put together that water is the greatest vehicle of this material known to mankind. And I suspect that there's a reason why they don't admit that, is because then there would be a major push to say, well, you have to clean the material up from the high country, which is exactly what well, actually, I was working it out the other day. It's close on 40 years of doing this material. So none of these people have my experience. None of them are willing to tell the truth about this stuff. It is transported by water. The greatest vehicle of this material in its growing, like expanding, is water. That's why we have strategic, specific targets. The DPI, in their books and their literature and all these things, identify birds and other mammals as the possible carriers of spreading this material. Birds didn't spread it like this. This is water spread it in these types of scenarios. It's too widespread. Birds pooped in that configuration along those. That's absolutely stupidity. It's water that's moved those plants through those areas. And that to the fact, I've cleaned this material out. See, I'm not even happy. I'm a grumpy old fella. I love my country and I hate seeing what this has been done to it. But you go further along this thing and you explore it more. The government also lied about the propagation of these plants. that it has a 4-year and a 7-year seedbed. I clear out Lantana from places and there is no regrowth, no comeback, right? They go through with the councils and everything else, and they played their games and they did their studies, and suddenly the Lantana's back. The Lantana's back because they're fighting a infestation that is just often 10 miles, 50 miles from, or say 10 to 50 kilometres, because we'll speak metric, from where they're actually at. And I don't mean as the crow flies, I mean by the tributary. Because it doesn't take creeks long to meander excessively long, kilometre levels without going a long, long distance. And when they're elevated, like there's 100-year-old Lantana up in the top of Mount Glorious there, that it has to be seen to be believed, the level of the infestation, just pouring seeds down into Sanford all the time, every time there's a major rain event. And that's what these guys are fighting. So that when they failed, right, and they all failed, they went back and said, whoa, geez, we've got to come up with a what's a name that makes sense to people. So we'll say that there's a 4-year and a 5-year and a 7-year or whatever it is seedbed that doesn't exist. It's regrowing there because you have Lantana above it, in higher country above it. Now that's our claim to fame, is that we operate in slopes with ease at 20 and 30 degree slopes, and we remove the material and leave the leaf litter sitting on the what's the name, and then it have that sort of success rate. Now you can't go, see down here, down in the leftish out, far, you can see a dead straight line of the Lantana running off on a sort of, let's say 45, on an angle to the gum tree there. That's where it's been dripping the water from the fence line down onto the ground, and the seeds have come along as the floodplains come along and deposited seeds at that point of the fence line, and then the dripping has propagated the thing. You see the same thing in the tree to the right of that fence line with the big gum tree. It was just slewing past it now. What you find is that if you look at the Australian landscape, you'll see where the canopy of the trees will drip. Look at all the Lantana bushes all through that section up there. It's absolutely criminal, and yet nobody's doing anything about this stuff. And this goes on for 20 odd kilometres out of the forestry. So you look at this stuff and you see how the dripping of the canopy propagates and greens the ground around the tree, and then the look at the trees in the canopy there being robbed of all the nutrients, that all the weeds are just growing glowing green, and the canopies are dying and being killed off. And people don't care when they tell you about the stories of, oh yeah, something might use it so we can't take out too much. We should be taking out all of the Lantana in one hit. Done and dusted. And then do the rehabilitation once that material's out, immediately. Straight onto it. It's one of the greatest furphies that they throw around, that, oh no, you should only do limited removal because something might suffer because of it. Yet you look at the truth of the Department of Primary Industries, the National Parks and Wildlife Service, and the other people with their own axes to grind within this lies and litigation of materials, and they'll walk through a forestry and drop a match in a forestry and burn out thousands of acres without any thought or recourse, with no problems at all, and they'll call it and say, oh, it's about reducing the fuel load, when it's about cleaning up the Lantana that's out of control at those levels. The amount of material that goes up into the atmosphere in black carbon from the fires and pollution is just staggering, and yet nobody talks about it, because the government has gone that far with mucking these things up that it doesn't suit them to be discussing the damage that's done in dropping a match into it. The same people that continually go on and on and on about this ecology, right, and they don't have an ecological bone in their body, talking about one or two animals that they say may live in there, may, which don't. Okay, they turn around and don't give a rat's about the animals that were just killed when they dropped a match in there and walked away. You know, the amount of carnage that goes on in those things, or in the poisoning of these materials, is staggering, and there is no accountability at all. Nobody takes it to these people before me. It's just staggering. And then you have the situation with the National Parks and Wildlife regenerators, bush regenerators, and the subcontractors of that. And you see how this Lyme disease is going with these people. And it's heartbreaking to see marriages gone, children in the womb that have been infected by the disease. And you look at it, how heartbreaking it is, and yet the government still covers that up and says, oh no, there's no Lyme disease in Australia. No, that doesn't exist. Yes, it's a derivative of the Lyme disease. Yes, it's a branch, a separate entity of the Lyme disease. But it's still under that same umbrella, and yet they play games and they lie to people while people are dying. You know, there are suicides, there are, losses of life with the complications because they were never diagnosed properly. And yet overseas, the laboratories, with their testing is completely head and shoulders above Australian standards, and yet we have the disease here. Why hasn't the government done anything about protecting workers? And that's the other point of these bush regenerators. How many of these people have no insurance cover in their subcontract situations? It's a disease that doesn't exist in this country. It's not recognised. How many of these people have no workers' compensation coverage? The government departments shaft all these workers as soon as they come down with it and they're diagnosed with it, and pension them off, and then they have to fight for every penny across those things. That's the trouble. Too many people, look at these infestations. It just it goes on and on, these infestations, and the dead trees in amongst them, and nothing is spoken about this stuff. Trust us, we've got it under control, says the government. And you look at the truth of it. Look at these things here. I could go on filming forever. I could spend weeks and months filming in our local area, just in the local area, without any trouble. No person by hand is going to make any significant thing in this in 1,000 years. Even groups of people, they do more damage to this ecology walking through it, 1,000 times, knocking things down and carting things out, than what I do moving across that landscape with the machinery. And that's a fact. And yet you are fighting continuously to get this information out there. Now, when you look at how these things are all conducted, we must rally to the politicians and force them to take action before we're at 35 million. Anyway, thank you. Bye-bye.